If the game gets extended by 1%, the average creep score will go up by 1.25, weighted exponentially, so that the most recent couple months had almost all of these. R squared versus the null is just how much better we can predict variations in a specific stat. Well, shit. I guess it works. I'm once again going to do the worst thing imaginable in a YouTube video. I'm just telling you upfront what I think most of you want to know. For cores, you want creep score, teamfight, GPM, tormentor kills, and deaths. Creep score and teamfight are the most important too. For mid, you want creep score, runes, teamfight, GPM, and tormentor. Runes and teamfight are the most important for mids. And for supports, you want wards placed, teamfight participation, smokes used, and stuns. For your final blue, you can choose either camp stacked or watchers. They're about equivalent to each other. There is some nuance to the strategy, but generally Cerulean and the Clutch are going to be your highest value team name options. And once all your roles are locked in, I've made a calculator that you can use to see which are the best estimated teams for your specific stats. From there, just use some judgment about how far you think each team will go in the bracket and choose the best team that balances high score with what you think is going to excel. You can find that calculator in the Patreon blog linked in the description of this video. You don't have to pay anything. You don't even have to subscribe to like a newsletter or something. It's just there. So if you found any of that useful, please just let the rest of this video play out, at least just in the background, because YouTube watches how long the video plays. And if I give you everything in the first 2 minutes and they find out, I'm pretty sure they're gonna send somebody in an unmarked van to like kill my dog. And I really like my dog. He's a super good boy. So if you found that useful, please let the video play out. Consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment before you tune me out to go do other things. Now, for everybody else who wants to make the very best fantasy draft possible, let's get into the real details. I really can't tell you how relieved I am to have done acceptably well in the first stage of Fantasy Dota this year. That's not because I really need to win. I honestly don't care. But because I knew that if I screwed up the fantasy analysis, then nobody would believe any of my analysis about Dota for the rest of time. There's something like 2 days before rosters lock for the main event, so it's time for some accountability. Last week, I put up the recommendations based on a detailed set of models that I made. And the nice thing about a detailed set of models is they can be tested. So today, we're going to test how good were our predictions from last week, what stats did we get wrong and what stats did we get right, how can we improve the model for the next stage, and what is the optimal strategy going into the main event of TI 2026. In my earlier analysis, I pointed out other prediction calculators were not properly accounting for how TI is different from the other events that they might be trained or processed on. One of those big differences is TI's impact on game length. It turns out even our model that assumed much longer games at TI was still an underestimate. The TI Swiss games averaged over 47 minutes per game, and that impacts every category in some way or another. What you're looking at here is the amount that we would have predicted if we had known in advance how long the typical game was, and then the amount that we actually observed in the game. One thing that we did get right is that games at TI tend to be much more conservative. So far in TI 2026, even though games are running 12% longer, we're seeing less activity in that 12%. There's fewer tormentors, smokes, and watchers per minute compared to most tournament play. The one outlier here is that there were way more courier snipes than we ever could have predicted. And the residual is how much of the error did not balance out between these two factors, which then went on to impact the accuracy of our predictions overall. Let's put some real numbers behind exactly how well our predictions have done so far. Don't worry, I'm going to explain all of this. It's not that complicated. Bias is just the difference between our estimate and the real value that we ended up seeing in the group stage. So for GPM, our bias is 1.7%, which means the average GPM was 1.7% worse than we had expected it to be. That tells us how well we understand the stat. The next three numbers tell us how well we understand the players. R here is the Pearson correlation coefficient. It asks how well did we understand the shape of the players within this stat's performance. So will all the players be stacked up together? Or will there be a bell curve? Or maybe there's a few large outliers with a very long tail. This P is actually pronounced rho, and if you don't like that, you can blame the Greeks. This measures within the shape of the graph, how well are we able to put players in the right order from best to worst. For both of these measurements, a 1 is a perfect score, and anything above a 0.6 is useful in this context, but higher is better. Finally, concordance tells us how often we're able to pick the better player when given 2 at random within the stat. 0.5 means we're correct 50% of the time, which is just a coin flip. Ranking players in stats like this is really a very complex problem. So anything above about a 0.7 lets us make meaningful guesses to the expected value of player choices. So altogether, a good score across all three of these stats would mean we understand the difference between players, we understand which players will be best, and we can pick the winners from a lineup. If we have a bad concordance but a good everything else, that means that we can probably pick the best teams overall, but maybe we can't really tell the difference between teams that are ranked near each other. Fortunately, we don't really need to do that for Dota Fantasy. We just need to get a good team in all cases. Getting the very best team, well, it usually just adds a few points on the end. As long as we have a solid row, it doesn't really matter to me if we have a great concordance. Although obviously, a good measurement in all of these stats does make it easier for us to make recommendations. Okay, the last two stats here are coverage, which just asks how often the results fall within an 80% predicted range. We want this to be at 0.8. Above 0.8 means that there's just fewer jackpot potentials in the stat than we would have expected. A value far below 0.8 means that we might just be guessing the right average, but we really are bad at predicting the outliers that account for how that average gets made up. What we're seeing here is that First Blood is it's a flat random event. We already knew that, but it is nice to see it confirmed. If you have First Blood as a stat, it really proves you shouldn't be trying to predict who's going to do best in it. Other highly random categories are Roshan, Tormentor, and Tower Kills. When we're thinking about teams to pick, we shouldn't really consider these specific stats very heavily because they're just not very predictable. Stuns are also pretty random because they're highly dependent on draft variables. Now, if you had a model that was really good at predicting team drafts as well, this would probably become a bit easier to predict. But our model is not heavily based around predicting what teams are going to draft. It's more based around how well they'll do in general. Finally, skill is how much better our model is at predicting outcomes compared to just using flat averages from the last 6 months of Dota games, which is what most of the other guides do. And here's those same stats broken down by each role. You can pause if you want to see these in detail. We are getting great results on pretty much every meaningful stat for every role, with the exception of some of the stats in support. And the reason for that is just support stats tend to be much more of a crapshoot. Whether a support will or won't get a Roshan kill is an extremely wide variation in points, and it's very hard to predict. The same thing is true for whether or not a support will even have a stun to stun with, or in a lot of cases, whether they'll have the opportunity to get a courier kill. So a lot of those green stats, particularly on support, have much higher biases and lower rows and concordance than I would probably like to see. I think that's just something we have to live with here because of the nature of the game. Why did I bother showing you all of that? Well, I think if you're going to follow my recommendations, I should at least do a reasonably good job of showing you the proof of why my model is worth trusting. So now all the data's out there and you can make a decision for yourself. We may be a little off here or there, but we're able to rank the stats in importance very effectively. And for the most important stats, we're also able to rank players pretty effectively. For people who really want to know, here are all of the charts for every single role, every single team, the actual and expected averages for every single stat of every color. I know these are burning through super fast, but you can slow down YouTube in the settings and kind of pause on the ones that you want. I think I probably burned through my allotment of attention span for staring at charts, so I'm going to move into the actual fantasy recommendations and leave this here for anybody who cares. Now that I've verified our method was overall quite strong, I've added all of the games from the group stage and recalculated everything for the main event. I've also changed the point projections for Watchers, Madstone, Tormentor, and Lotuses based on the actual fantasy points from the group stage. The reason I had to do this is because the written rules that Valve provided are actually wrong for how Watchers and Tormentor are calculated, and Valve did not provide documentation for how Madstone or Lotuses work. Because of that, in the first stage, I had to make some estimates for all of these categories, and I'm now able to dial those estimates in using the actual fantasy points scraped directly out of the replays. As a quick aside, I was able to quickly do this and put out a video specifically because of an awesome parser tool made by Hockey74, who has their own fantasy calculator available for free. You can find it on Reddit, and I've linked it in the description. So if for whatever reason you don't like my calculator, go and give theirs a shot. How exactly does Fantasy Dota change for the main event? Well, the big difference is you'll have 5 stats per banner instead of just 3, and there's a much higher risk in picking teams that might be eliminated early. Let's go over each role and the anticipated average value for each stat the role can take. I'll also show you the expected spread between the best team and the worst team, on average. A high spread means the team pick matters a lot more, whereas a low spread means you just want the team that will play the most games. The CV is the coefficient of variation, which is the standard deviation divided by the mean. It just means that these points are reliable or not reliable. Over a 0.8 is completely luck-based, whereas below a 0.3 almost never varies. In a really good composition, what we want are 1 to 2 stats with a high CV, 1 to 2 stats with a pretty predictable CV between 0.3 and 0.4, and 1 very reliable stat under 0.3. We want this kind of CV distribution because it radically increases the likelihood that all of our stats will have good returns in the same game. That maximizes our points in the final series we end up keeping. If we have everything with low CVs, we really don't have any room to grow. So we need to have a little bit of unreliability in order to try and hit some jackpots and get the highest score we possibly can. But you do not want to stack 3 or more high variance stats together because the odds are very bad that you'll end up hitting them all in the same game, let alone across the whole series. When assessing the high CV stats, you should also consider P0, which is the probability that this category will get you no points in any specific game. Things like First Blood, Roshan kills, and Courier kills are very likely to return no points in any given game, and that means that you're much less likely to hit it alongside all your other stats at one time. Finally, Team Gap converts the spread to a percentage, and it makes it easier to compare across stats. A low team gap just means that team choice doesn't matter, and a high team gap means that team choice matters a lot. Be warned, a high team gap doesn't necessarily mean we know which team you want to pick, just that we know it will matter. For example, on First Blood and Courier kills, we've already seen from the earlier stats that team predictions are very unreliable, so you probably want to avoid these categories unless you like to live dangerously. On cores, you want creep score, teamfight, GPM, tormentor kills, and deaths. Once you get either GPM or creep score in a red slot, you should lock it in. The expected value is really poor for re-rolling either of these stats, even if that means that you're also going to get to re-roll 2 mediocre red stats as well. The 3 highest priority stats for a core are GPM, creep score, and teamfight. all of which have about a 35% expected value gain over the next highest stat of their color, and an even better expected value gain over the average alternative of their color. For mid, you want Creep Score, Runes, Teamfight, GPM, and Tormentor. The two most important are Runes and Teamfight, both of which are nearly 200% higher value than the next closest in their category. That enormous gap of expected value means that for mids, it's basically never worth boosting a quality or trait if you could instead be rolling for Teamfight or Runes before you get them. Trading in any other blue or green for one of those two stats is the single highest expected value improvement you can make to your roster. For supports, you want wards placed, teamfight participation, smokes used, stuns. For your final blue, either Camp Stacked or Watchers are about the same value. Camp Stacked has a higher jackpot value, but with less reliable output, and it's harder to predict which teams will be able to execute on it. Watchers are more reliable, but they have a lower peak value, very marginally. Overall, they're easier to choose teams for, though. Teamfight participation is once again the single greatest improvement to score you can make on a support. I would not bother with traits or qualities until you get it, as long as rolling a green is an option. Here's the reroll focus priority that I'm recommending. Anywhere that I say at any cost, what I mean is that you should do it even if it forces you to reroll otherwise decent banner stats. And you should still be doing it even if it means that you have to not roll something important on another banner. At any cost just means it's the highest priority. So in order of priority, you should first improve one random quality. It's incredible value, I would take it every time, and just put it in the place where you have the lowest average tier. Second, at any cost, reroll mid until you get runes. Third, at any cost, reroll mid until you get teamfight. Fourth, at any cost, reroll support until you get teamfight. Fifth, at any cost, reroll core until you get teamfight. Sixth, try to get creep score and GPM for core, but do not reroll one to try and get both. Seventh, try to get creep score and GPM on mid, but again, don't reroll one to try and get both. Eighth, if you do have two friendlies on one banner, then you should try to get a third. Ninth, lower one quality and increase two qualities if you have a banner with at least 3 tier 3 or lower stats. 10th, change trait if your current trait is giving under 35% net boost. Other traits that you should consider re-rolling at this priority are if you have a Vampiric somewhere in a middle row or Benevolent somewhere on the edge. And 11th, at kind of the lowest priority, you can also try to get the other recommended stats I haven't mentioned already, as long as it doesn't mean re-rolling one of the best stats that I've already put in the priority list. If you could get the ideal 5 for every roll, it will have a pretty substantial impact to your overall scoring potential. Woo, all right, let's take a breath. Now that you have the roll strategy, I am going to make it a little bit easier for the prefixes, suffixes, and team choice. Most of what I said for the first stage remains true for the next stage. One thing I think you should keep in mind is that the value of the clutch is going up because we have gotten rid of the 8 worst performing teams. So all the remaining teams are much more closely packed together in terms of their performance, at least so far. And that increases the likelihood that you're going to have a game 3 in any given series. For example, in my group stage, I took the lucky, but I'm definitely switching to the clutch for the main event. Your mileage may vary, it's really up to you. And I could do the same thing I did on the last video and go over every single set of stats for every single team for the people who really want to dive into it. But we are approaching 20 minutes on this video and I am running out of time to get it out. So instead, I just took all of my new research and the same prompt I used to make the first calculator with AI, and I shoved it all into the same AI bot and then did a little debugging. The calculator is updated with all of the group stage data and all of the changes to scoring that I made. And I think I'm going to cut it there to try to keep this relatively close to 20 minutes. So all that's left to say is thanks for watching and consider liking and subscribing. If you are a Patreon supporter, I'm going to be posting another commentary video of my main event fantasy rolls sometime later today, but first I need to crash. If you would like to see that video, please consider joining the fine people who are coming up on your screen now for as little as 75 cents a week. It's almost free. This is just my 8th video on YouTube, and the fact that I can keep putting in these massive efforts is due entirely to their generosity. So please consider helping out. Oh, and we also have a pretty cool Discord that you can join. So I want to thank the Fam of the Cow supporters, Where Did My Ants Go, Dota 2 PowerPoints, Nico, Not Tat Dat, Rose Nightfluer, and A Eyeball. I also want to thank Friend of the Cow supporters Hans Leek, Adriel, Friendly Fire 137, Mikhail B, Svenge, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, and Saint Catfish. Once again, you are the ones that keep this channel going, along with all of the Fan of the Cow supporters that you see going across your screen now.